Welcome back to Madani Shamsuddin's critique. Today we begin something serious. We begin with the man who, in a very real sense, began Western philosophy itself, or at least gave it the shape it still wears today. His name is Plato. He lived in Athens roughly between 427 and 347 before the Common Era. And if that sounds like ancient history, it is. But here is the thing about Plato. He never quite stayed in the past. Every century finds him again. Every generation argues with him again. And that, I want to suggest to you from the very start, is not an accident. Before we enter the philosophy, let us meet the man, or as much of him as history allows us to see. Plato was first a student. He sat at the feet of Socrates, that strange, barefoot figure who wandered the streets of Athens asking uncomfortable questions and making powerful men feel foolish. From Socrates, Plato inherited the method of relentless, disciplined questioning. We call it the Socratic method. Plato would spend the rest of his life refining it and crucially writing it down so that we could all be questioned by it across 24 centuries. Then Plato became a teacher. He founded the school, the Academy in Athens, widely considered the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. And among his students was a young man from Macedonia named Aristotle, who studied there for 20 years, absorbed everything Plato taught, and then magnificently systematically disagreed with most of it. That disagreement between master and pupil is itself one of the great intellectual dramas of human history. We will return to it, but here, uh, but here is what I want you to notice about Plato, the writer, because this is where he becomes remarkable, even before we open the philosophy. Plato never speaks in his own voice, not once. His ideas come to us through dialogues, dramatic conversations, often between Socrates and someone else, in which ideas are tested, pushed, overturned, rebuilt. Plato is always the stage manager, never the actor. That is a literary choice as deliberate as it is bewildering, and it tells us something important for Plato. Truth is not announced, it is arrived at together through conversation. Now, before we go any further into the philosophy itself, I want to give you a sense of the scale of what we are dealing with. Alfred North Whitehead, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, made a remark that has never quite been forgotten. He said, and I quote, "All of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato." That is an extraordinary thing to say, and it is worth pausing on. It does not mean that every philosopher after Plato simply agreed with him and uh, copied him down. Far from it. Aristotle, as I said, disagreed profoundly. Later thinkers revised him, rejected him, argued against him with enormous energy, but Whitehead's point is structural. It is about Iran. Plato was the one who first surveyed the landscape of the great philosophical questions. What is real? How do we know anything? What is the good life? What is justice? What is beauty? What is love? He raised those questions so powerfully, so precisely, that um, every thinker who came after him, even those who hated his answers, had to engage with his questions. And to engage with his questions is already to be, in some sense, on his territory. And then there were those who came back to him entirely, the Neoplatonists of the second century, Plotinus above all, the Cambridge Platonists of the 17th century, who tried to reconcile his vision with Christian theology. The great Romantic poets and philosophers of the 19th century, for example, Li, above all, who read Plato the way others read scripture. His shadow, as Whitehead said, falls over all of it. The theory of forms, now we come to the heart of it, the idea that is hardest and most important and most strange. Plato believed and argued with extraordinary rigor that behind the physical world we see, touch, and move through, there exists another word, a permanent word, a perfect word, a word not made of matter but of what he called forms, or ideas, eternal archetypes, of which everything in our material world is merely an imperfect copy. Let me give you the example from the text, because it is both useful and a little comic. Think of a desk. The physical desk in this room or in your classroom came into being at some point. A carpenter built it. It exists now. It will eventually be broken, thrown away, turned to sawdust. It is time bound. Is it a perfect desk? Of course not. Uh, its legs are slightly uneven, perhaps. Its surface is scratched. Its very materiality, as the text says, precludes perfection. But then, what is a desk? How did the carpenter know what to make? He had somewhere in his mind the concept of a desk, the idea of the desk, and that idea, Plato would say, is timeless. It preceded every physical desk ever built. It will outlast every desk that will ever exist. It is pure, it is real, more real, in fact, than the physical object in the room. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, is there also a Platonic form of manure, of pencil shavings? And I want to reassure you that question has been asked for 2,500 years, and Plato has an answer. Things that are formless, mud, sawdust, chaos, have no form, because they are, by definition, formless. A form requires something to have a shape, an essence, a nature. But here is the deeper problem with the desk example in the text. Is honest about it. Most of us do not feel in our daily lives any particular acquaintance with the Platonic idea of a desk. It is not apparent that it is a higher or better thing than a material desk. It is certainly much harder to do one's work on. So Plato offers us a better door into the theory, and that door is mathematics. So we have the geometry that Plato argued. So we can say, think about a geometry class. You draw a circle on the board. It is not a perfect circle, the chalk wobbles. Radius is slightly off. But you are not really talking about that circle, you are talking about the circle, the ideal perfect abstract circle of which your drawing is merely a rough approximation. The theorem you prove is not about the drawing. The drawing is just a tool to help you think. The proof itself, the eternal truth, is what counts. And Plato grasped this deeply. He understood that in mathematics class, even quite ordinary students are already working with the ideal and the material. Simultaneously, the diagram is material, the proof is ideal, and the proof is what matters. This is why above the door of his school, the academy in Athens, there was reportedly a warning, a prerequisite, an intellectual bouncer, if you will. It read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Not because Plato wanted to teach mathematics, but because he wanted students who had already felt in their bones the difference between a diagram and a proof, between an imperfect copy and a perfect original, between the material and the ideal. Because once you have had that experience, once you have proved the Pythagorean theorem and felt the absolute non-negotiable certainty of it, you are ready. You are ready to understand that truth, goodness, and beauty are not just words. They are forms. They are real. They shape everything: human knowledge, right action, artistic endeavor, love. That is Plato's claim, and it is not a modest one. Now, to understand why Plato made this claim, we need to understand who he was arguing against: the Sophists. The word today has a bad ring to it. Sophistry means clever but dishonest argument, but the original Sophists were something more serious than that. They were teachers, professional, paid, respected teachers of what we would today call rhetoric and composition, the languages or the language arts, the art of constructing a persuasive argument. Figures like, for example, Gorgias, Lysias, you will encounter them in Plato's dialogues, as the opponent Socrates patiently dismantles. They were not stupid, they were not frauds, they were the leading intellectuals of their day. Their claim was this: mastery of language leads to mastery of truth. Learn to argue well, learn to speak precisely, and you will arrive at virtue and knowledge. Language is the path. And Plato looked at this claim and was frightened, not intellectually dismissive, genuinely frightened. Because here is the problem: language shifts, words change meaning, rhetoric can be used to argue any side of any question. A skilled enough speaker can make the worse argument be the better. Plato knew this, had seen it happen in the courtroom that convicted and executed his teacher, Socrates. If the highest realities, truth, goodness, beauty, were as mutable and manipulable as human speech, then reality itself was available to the cleverest person uh, in the room. And that, for Plato, was a catastrophe. The forms are his answer to that fear. The forms are what cannot be argued away. The forms are what remain when the rhetoric stops. Like language, the text tells us even matter could be shaped to cheat and deceive. The forms cannot. They are beyond language, beyond matter, beyond manipulation. That is why they had to exist. Let me give you the vocabulary you will need going forward. These are the 6 terms that will come up again and again. In this lecture, in the next, and in everything we read together after that. The forms of eidos: eternal, perfect, archetypes, truth, goodness, beauty, the real structure behind the material world. Idealism, Plato's philosophical position. The immaterial world of forms is more real than the physical world we inhabit, not less real, more. Doxa and episteme, opinion and knowledge. Opinion is what we have about the material world, changeable, unreliable, tied to the senses. Knowledge is what we have about the forms, permanent, certain, arrived at through reason. The Academy, Plato's school in Athens, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, the place where the conversation began. We have the Sophists, Plato's intellectual antagonists, not villains, but the people whose position he found most dangerous and whose danger drove him to build the theory of forms. And finally, mimesis, imitation. The material desk imitates the idea of the desk. The diagram imitates the ideal circle. The copy imitates the original. This concept of mimesis will become absolutely central when we arrive at Book X of the Republic, where Plato turns it against the poets. Which brings me to where we are going next. In our next session, we will read Book X of the Republic, and it is one of the most provocative, most unsettling things Plato ever wrote. Because in it, uh, the philosopher who loved beauty, who wrote some of the most elegant prose in the ancient world, sits down and argues systematically, calmly, that poets should be banished from the ideal city. Why? What has poetry done to deserve this? What does mimesis, imitation, mean for art, for truth, for the moral life? These are not easy questions, and Plato's answers are not comfortable ones, but they are questions we cannot afford to ignore, not if we take literature and criticism seriously. So read book X, thinks about it, and I will see you in the next lecture. This has been Madani Shamsuddin's critique. Thank you for your attention.